Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Wilson Center. My name is Duncan Wood. I'm the Vice President for Strategy and New Initiatives here. It's great to see some folks here in the auditorium in person. Thank you for coming. Obviously we have a much larger web audience today, and we're grateful to everybody who's tuning in. As of this morning, we had over 200 people who had signed up to watch this event. And that immediately makes me think that this is something which is not just in the headlines, but it's something which really hits home for a lot of folks in terms of the challenges they face, either in the private sector or in government, in how to maximize our levels of trust in supply chains through the application of technology. We're delighted to have with us some very distinguished guests today. And so I will go from along to my left, beginning with Evan Smith. Evan is the CEO of Altana AI. Great to have you with us, Evan. You'll be speaking later on about supply chains, information flows, etc. We then have Bob Rogers, who is the CEO of OII Inc., a company that applies artificial intelligence to the management of supply chains. We then have Julie Mendoza, who is a partner, International Trade Practice Group at Morris, Manning & Martin LLP. Julie, welcome. Thank you very much. You'll be talking to us a lot about compliance and the new demands that are being placed on companies today. And we have here a very good friend of the Wilson Center, Jorge or George Waldenberg, CEO of Corpac Group and of Visual Logics. And I'll be turning to Jorge in a second to say some welcoming remarks. We'll also be having with us, he's a little bit delayed because of traffic, Justin Goldston, who's a professor of project and supply chain management at Penn State University, who has written a very interesting piece for us at the Wilson Center on why trust matters in supply chains. Now, how did all of this begin? Well, I'm actually going to turn that over to Jorge in a second to explain the origins of this project at the Wilson Center. But one of the things that we have learned over the past year or so is that this is something which is of deep, deep interest and concern to private sector actors, but also to government. And as we were just discussing in the pre-conference chat, we're facing a situation today where, with all of the focus on supply chains, in terms of supply disruption, but also political, security, geopolitical, ESG concerns, we're trying to find ways in which we can square the circle between increasing compliance with government regulations at the same time as we do not sacrifice, or even how we can increase efficiency in supply chains as well. And so the purpose of the Waldenberg initiative on building trust in supply chains is to see how we can apply technology to supply chain management to satisfy both of those conditions. So without any further ado, let me pass the microphone over to Jorge Waldenberg, who will talk a little bit about the Waldenberg initiative and why it's important that we continue to support this work. And then we're going to come on to opening remarks. And we'll come back to Jorge at the end of the session to talk a little bit about what Visual Logics does. But Jorge, over to you.
Well, Duncan, thank you very much for your remarks, your kind introduction. And want to thank the Wilson Center for partnering with our family to address this issue. There is no doubt that the time has come to tackle this issue. I want to thank our fellow panelists today for joining us today, and also for the amazing work that you do to address this issue. We launched this initiative a little bit over a year ago with only one goal in mind: to find ways to increase the reliability and the security of our supply chains. All of that while reducing existing vulnerabilities in world trade. Current practices of international trade are now easily outsmarted by new technologies. For example, what do paper invoices, packing lists, bill of lading, certificates of origin, what do they all have in common? Well, for starters, they're all paper-based, right? And they can easily be recreated by any third grader with a computer or a Photoshop. What is at stake? We know what's at stake, right? Fair trade, job, product integrity, safety, national security, and even the environment. There is no longer room in world trade for primitive Flintstone-era type practices in trade. It's time to restore full faith in transactions, and we believe that by partnering with experts and innovators like our colleagues here today, we can help to create new world standards that eliminate the risk gap and help us contend with them. So thank you very much for doing this. Back to you, Duncan.
Jorge, thank you very much. Excellent introduction to why this matters. To our online audience, let me just say that we'll be taking questions through our web portal. So if you just go to the web portal for this event, there will be a little part of that web page where you can send in a question, and we'll be checking those, and I'll be receiving those from my colleague Mary D'Amico, who I want to take the time to thank for organizing this event as well. Let us begin the conversation here, Julie, by turning to you. If you could talk a little bit about how compliance issues are impacting supply chains today, the concerns that you're seeing from the private sector, and some ideas about how we can go about addressing those.
Thank you, Duncan, and thank you, Jorge, for the invitation to speak today. Good morning. As Duncan said, I'm an international trade lawyer. And I've seen my practice and the issues that we're discussing today really go from sort of the back business section news to really front page coverage, because they've become such an important aspect of the way of our macro and microeconomic environment. I would say that since I work with virtually only importers, foreign exporters, and governments, that during the Trump era, my life was a little too dynamic. Certainly, it was a little scary for me to wake up in the mornings and read the front page and see what had happened that day. Well, I really should say tweets, right? Because the way we found out about the Section 232 duties was through a tweet. So, but putting that aside for a minute, I just wanted to talk a little bit about, how these compliance-related issues really have to be incorporated into the systems that everyone's going to be talking about today. Because there really is an increased sense that you have to really enforce these provisions, and usually at the border. That's become more and more common. Certainly the biggest news is that the U.S. Customs and Border Protection wants to expand the reporting obligations and therefore the liability to actors up and down the supply chain. So while the focus might have been in the past on the importer of record, who bore responsibility for the documentation, filling out, paying all the duties, et cetera, obviously customs and many in the private sector are not happy with the circumstance in which only the importer of record is responsible. So what that means is that you can't sort of sit back and say, well, I'm not importing this product, so I don't really have to worry about all of these enforcement regimes that are out there, because you do. And they're going to have customs is going to create greater visibility into supply chains in ways that, are probably pretty unexpected right now, but are certainly in the process of being developed. One example I was going to give you that's pretty new, and that's the whole Enforce and Protect Act of Customs that gives Customs much broader authority to investigate any problem, any illegality, or any incorrect origin, et cetera, of a product. And what does that mean? That means that these are secret investigations that are undertaken without the targets ever knowing that these investigations are ongoing. In fact, the company doesn't even learn of the investigation until they get a notice that Customs has initiated an investigation and oftentimes imposed immediate penalties. And in fact, it's not even until you get to court that you get the confidential information that the Customs Service has against you. And one important thing to keep in mind is these cases are most frequently started by competitors of the importer or the downstream consumers of those products. So this is the kind of thing, as you can imagine, that if you sort of wait until you have a problem, i.e. you get the notice that the case has been initiated against you, you're probably going to have a very hard time putting together the kind of information you need to defend yourself. So unless you have a system in place that can prove and is verifiable and credible that in fact you know everything that happened in that supply chain and know that is not a product that was produced in China, shipped to Thailand, and then shipped to the US, because I've got the documents to prove it, This is often the problem, okay, that people do not understand that the burden is on you to prove that, in fact, you know what those supply chains look like, who shipped the product, where it went. This is coming up very often in the context of forced labor provisions. We talked about in our meeting prior to this about how the most textile and apparel manufacturers had to shift as much as 70 to 80% of their production out of China, right? Because of the forced labor provisions, which are focused on the Uyghur regions. But of course, China now has moved many of the Uyghurs into other areas of China. So now the companies just feel like they're not prepared or able to prove that the product didn't in some way come from Uyghur labor, forced labor. So that's something that is a good example of these types of investigations. Probably the most frequent type of customs enforcement, though, has to do with things like dumping duties. Okay, dumping duties, there are hundreds of orders against companies and products on dumping. U.S. steel industry has probably filed cases on every single product in every single country that's ever come into the United States. Imagine the revenue associated with that, because the way dumping duties work is they're an ad valorem percentage, in most cases, of the value of the goods. So if you have to pay 20% dumping duties, right, then you have got to be prepared to pay that at the border. Now, one problem is that oftentimes what happens is that companies, once they're caught up in dumping cases, move their operations to another country, ship all the stuff from the country where the dumping order originated, and then start shipping to the United States. Now, that sounds like a very bad practice to everybody, right? But here's the problem. If you're the importer or you're the company that's relying on supply, and all of a sudden all you know is that product can't be obtained from China anymore, but it sure can from Thailand or Indonesia, you might be tempted to go and buy that product there, right? And so that's the problem you're going to have, because if you do that, U.S. duties are retroactive. So they can be retroactive for entries that you've made over an entire year plus penalties. And these are cases that are just proliferating at an exponential rate, really. So if you find that your source of supply suddenly has been cut off, and this is a common thing, right? I mean, given all these dumping cases, I mean, they cover all products: cabinets, solar panels, semiconductors. I mean, it's not like it's focused on one particular type of product. So this is a big problem that people have to be very aware of in their supply chain. And I'm going to cut off now because I know I've probably gone over my time. I just would note that environmental regulation is increasingly also coming on stream in terms of operations and controls at the border. Thank you, Duncan.
Thank you, Julie. I could actually listen to that all day and get more and more worried, I have to say. I'm
That's
glad.
my job. I'm Debbie.
Thank you. Yeah, I am. I'm glad I'm not a CEO. That's all I can say. But I mean, one of the things that comes out of that, Julie, is and sort of going back to my sort of nerdish political science, international relations roots, is that for many years we've been taught the myth of globalization and free trade, and the fact is, as one representative of a foreign government said once here at the Wilson Center, he said, any free trade agreement, all free trade agreements are actually the same. There's a page about how free trade is so important, and then 300 pages about all the ways in which you're going to restrict trade, right? And I think that's the reality, right? And it's becoming more and more complex, as you just eloquently explained, about all of the demands that private actors are facing as they try to get goods into the country. And of course, this is very politically sensitive, not just because of geopolitical concerns, not just because of security concerns, but of course because of cost concerns, inflation for the consumer, and that ultimately is where we're facing this major challenge of trying to square the circle. To help us resolve that, I want to move on to Bob Rogers, CEO of OIA, who could talk a little bit about the work that you guys are doing on applying artificial intelligence to supply chains. Over to you, Bob.
Thanks, Duncan. So thank you for inviting me today, and it's wonderful to see all of you in the audience. I have to give Jorge a special thanks. This is a very formidable panel, and I appreciate that you brought up the Flintstones to make me feel at ease here. So I'm Bob Rogers. I'm CEO and co-founder of OII.ai. We are a company that builds automation around supply chain configuration and design using AI and digital twin. I'm going to tell you a little bit about my history because it sort of helps understand how we got to where we are with what we're doing in supply chain. So I've worked in AI and I've worked in digital twin. On the AI side, I was a leader of a tech team that helped develop the world's first FDA-cleared AI on a medical device. That was at University of California, San Francisco. Let me just bring up my notes here. I know about my history, but the next part will get me in trouble. So I'm also a member of the board of advisors for the Harvard Institute of Applied Computational Science. I was previously chief data scientist at Intel, where I led Intel's partner ecosystem for analytics and AI. And then finally, I was co-founder and chief scientist at Apixio, a healthcare AI company that was acquired in 2020. So I've done quite a bit of deploying real AI systems to solve problems. But if you go back to my beginnings, I have a PhD in physics, and my research early on was actually, believe it or not, building digital twins of supermassive black holes. So that was, start with the hardest problem,
Yeah.
and then it's a strategy. I'm not sure it was a good strategy, but anyway, and actually that work did, you may have seen some recent photos from the Webb telescope and others of supermassive black holes outside in other galaxies. And it did prove my theory of 1992 that it was going to be a really long time before anything I did mattered. So moving on to other things was a great move. So the work on digital twin moved forward through a number of different technical areas. And so the key thing for me is we're at a place where digital twin technology, which obviously has been around forever, is combining with AI and with scale to create some opportunities to automate that really have never happened before. And so we're applying that to supply chain. My co-founders are Vishnu Vyas, who's an AI guru, and David Evans, who's a 35-year veteran of supply chain, oversaw two of the largest supply chain management software deployments in Europe. So lots of sort of AI and supply chain experience. And so when we talk about trust is really about reliability. Can we rely on our systems to give us the performance we need, the performance we expect? And at OII, we're really developing technologies to help us have more trust in the performance of our supply chains and using AI and automation to drive that. So why is it that we need this so much right now? We're seeing a lot of disruption. I don't think anyone would disagree that there seems to be a lot of disruption in supply chain right now. And we think about war in Ukraine. We think about the pandemic. We think about the ship getting caught in the Suez Canal. But actually, all of those are just highlighting a problem that was already there. Because supply chain, for many, many years, has not been built to be able to withstand disruption. And in fact, there's a huge amount of manual effort that goes into supply chains to overcome even small disruptions. So the bottom line is supply chain technology is built on the assumption that everything is static. Your lead times in your network are static. You base your entire plan on a forecast. And so, yes, of course, you know that the forecast's not going to be perfectly right, but still you're starting with an assumption of a forecast. Furthermore, the way supply chains are designed and configured, humans actually set all the parameters and make all the decisions without the aid of hardly any technical tools at all, and certainly none that are aware of variability. Now, when you think about variability, what I'm really talking about is not, variations in demand from month to month, but the variability of variability. So what do I mean by that? Well, I'm just going to watch the audience. Everyone's familiar with the stock market, right? Okay. Now, raise your hand if you agree with me that the variability in the stock market is different from week to week and month to month and year to year. I mean, 1987 was not 2018. Am I correct? So variability changes over time. And so the same thing happens in supply chain. And so we need to have technologies that do that. So what we do at OII is we actually use AI to predict what kind of future variability we might expect. What are the different ways the forecast will go wrong? How might demand change in the future? And what are all the different scenarios we need to take into account? Same thing for lead times and supplier disruption. What are the things we should take into account as part of our overall planning today so that we can avoid risk? And so we use AI to predict that, and then we take all those scenarios and we run them through this digital twin that we've built to show us, well, this is what would happen under these circumstances. If we go through a bunch of different scenarios, what's the setting or the setup or the strategy that allows us to be most resilient now and in the future? And then finally, the next piece of it is monitoring the behavior of the underlying components. So for instance, it used to be, I mean, it's still the case in the software, lead times are fixed. People put a fixed lead time for, a shipment from Shanghai to San Francisco. But we can all attest to the fact that those numbers have been jumping all over the place lately, right? So you need to be able to monitor. And this is where what I'm talking about really connects with what these guys do and what everyone is talking about here. Monitoring and tracking the key things, being able to get the information down at the ground level. So we monitor, and then because the system is fully automated, we can then respond very quickly. You can see where your risks are, where you're likely to have stockouts or service disruptions, where there are costs, where there might be discards, and then you can quickly adapt and come up with new ways of doing things that allow you to move forward. So if I think about policy and strategy in supply chain and how to respond to the fact that variability is variable, the two core concepts are monitor. You got to measure what's going on in the real world, not just take assumptions, and automate. And actually, we were just talking, I'm just going to throw one last thing in, and then I'll conclude. Does anybody know what the world's most, and this is over half the companies use it, what the world's most common supply chain software is? Anybody have any guesses? Excel. Yes, Excel. Excel is the most common supply chain management software. So the opportunities to bring live data in and automate are enormous. And so that's what we're promoting as a concept and what we do as a principle. And the result, we hope, will be supply chain performance that we can trust. Thanks.
Thank you, Bob. I want to add in a couple of comments here. In one of our previous conversations, you talked to me about reducing risk mitigation in supply chains, because we're never going to eliminate risk in supply chains, which is a very important thing. But you put it to me in a very clear way, which was to say, your supply chain manager or your VP for supply chain is somebody who is constantly putting out fires. If we can just reduce the number of fires that they have to put out, so things that, in fact, whilst we may not be able to predict them, AI has a better way of predicting them, okay? Then that helps that supply chain manager to focus his or her bandwidth on the crises that really matter. And I think that's something that really hits home after the year that we've had, right? Secondly, you mentioned my favorite word right now, which is resilience. And I'm grateful to you for that. In all of the supply chain work that we're doing here at the Wilson Center, both through the Waldenberg initiative, but also through the work that we've done on critical minerals, semiconductors, and now we're moving into electric vehicles. And let me just take a moment to thank GM and Jasper Jung, who is here today, for their support on that work on supply chains. But in every single one, in different ways, we come up against the word of resilience. And it's to say, you cannot eliminate risk. Risk is, problems are going to happen, challenges are going to happen. So how do you make yourself better able to adapt and to resolve those issues when they come up? And so that's where I see, a lot of the work that you guys are doing. And that leads me very nicely into Evan. Evan, similar kind of approach to recognizing the complexity of supply chains. But I wonder if you could talk to us about Altana AI and what your proposed solutions are for this.
Yeah, well, thank you for the opportunity to be here and be with distinguished panelists and talking about one of the sort of most important topics in the front page of the news on a day-to-day basis. So if you look across climate disruptions, if you look across national security concerns, if you look across compliance and all the trade disruptions, and of course inflation and the supply chain shocks, the nexus of all of those issues is really the supply chain. So we're talking about trust, and I want to make the assertion that we can't have trust without truth. So we are in the business of building a dynamic, intelligent model of the supply chain network, fed by both public and non-public data, critically, in order to provide a shared source of truth that's used by governments and logistics providers and global enterprises, on top of which they can build trusted supply chain networks. That's what Altana does. So let's back up. What the frame for all of this is that we've built a global supply chain network and really a global economy that was motivated by efficiency and outsourcing. What that did was effectively locally optimize, you're a mathematician, the buyer-supplier relationship. So we have a one-to-one relationship between a buyer and a supplier, and we've obscured in the fog the extended network of upstream suppliers and downstream customers. So if you look at the investments in visibility and automation and planning, it's really concentrated on that direct buyer-supplier relationship. And that makes sense. We've outsourced our supply chains. We've built just-in-time manufacturing. And what that produced is a very fragile world, which we're experiencing today. And what that produced is a very opaque world. So if you're trying to solve climate problems in a real way, if you're trying to address the national security threats in a rare earth supply chain or a renewable energy supply chain, these are all fundamentally network problems. So what we're focused on at Altana is revealing that network. And naively, let's imagine we go knock on the door of U.S. Customs and Border Protection, and we knock on the door of Maersk and UPS and SAP, which handles vast quantities of supply chain data, and we said, we want to build this global data utility, the Google Maps for the supply chain. Everybody give us your data. We're going to stitch it all together, and it's going to be nirvana. Sounds good, right? So of course, that's not going to work. And so the sort of core invention of what we're doing, it's both a technical and a legal innovation, is we've architected a federated learning platform. What that means is that imagine a hub with many, many spokes across a federated network of siloed data. So in the hub, just like a quantitative hedge fund, we're streaming in all the data we can get our hands on from commercial sources, from the web, from publicly available data sets. That only gets you so far. What's very novel is we take that fused data set, which we call a knowledge graph. So LinkedIn has a knowledge graph of your business relationships. Facebook has a knowledge graph of your social network. We're building a knowledge graph of the supply chain network itself. So we take that graph, we take the computing platform, and we take the machine learning systems that power the whole platform, and we make a copy of it, and we paste it down into a dedicated, isolated, single-tenant spoke in which we operate upon customer data. So what that creates then is a federated network where there's both publicly available data and non-public data that we're connecting to and learning from. And the whole point is we can't share the data. So what we are not doing is sharing data across this federated network. What we are doing is sharing learnings across the federated network. So we build out our map of the world. We understand risk. We understand time series-based flows and disruptions in the network. So we actually could see in advance that the chips were going away from automotive downstream applications and toward consumer electronics. So you could have been ahead of that. So then what do you do with that shared source of truth? we help our customers who are, again, government agencies, big logistics companies, enterprises who are actually getting into the insurance world now. We enable them to connect and collaborate across a multi-tier supply chain network. And we talk a lot about the next phase of globalization. We say globalization 2.0 is going to be defined by trusted business networks. So instead of sort of pushing the liability and the environmental impact and the cost upstream in the fog, this next phase of globalization, for all the reasons that Julie was talking about and others, is really going to be much more explicitly defined around national security prerogatives, around trade compliance prerogatives, around environmental prerogatives, and around resiliency prerogatives. So we're helping these multiple parties illuminate the network and then begin to connect and collaborate across the network around those dimensions. So I have environmental concerns I care about, I have national security concerns I care about. They can set the terms within our platform, they can collaborate across the platform, and that to us is trusted networks.
Fantastic, Evan. Thank you. Speaking very eloquently about how we can build trust, quite literally, into the supply chain network, and the phrase that you just pulled out, which is the next phase of globalization. Alan Burson, who's with us today, nice to see you, Alan, talked about globalization 2.0. How we begin to see a more complex form of globalization, not just cutting costs. This is something that is of great interest here at the Wilson Center. In fact, I'm currently working right now with Saskia Bonfoy on a paper where we're talking about the evolution of supply chain thinking, loosely titled From Value to Values. And this, how we're actually coming to a much more nuanced approach to supply chains that is obviously a lot more complex. We're delighted that Justin Goldson has joined us up here on stage. Justin, thanks for struggling in through the traffic today.
Yes,
I'm sorry that you had a tough
brutal.
time. It's the first test of anybody who wants to work with the Wilson Center. Can you actually make it here?
Right.
Okay, and we're very glad that you did. Justin has written a paper for us on why trust matters in supply chains. And if it's okay with you, Justin, I'm going to go to Jorge Waldenberg to talk a little bit about visual logics before we go to Justin, because I think that your more theoretical approach to this will come in very nicely at the end of the discussion of sort of the complex realities, and then we can move into the Q&A. And while I mention Q&A, please prepare your questions here in the audience, and for those of you online, please send in your questions through the web portal. There's a little question box underneath the video stream. Jorge.
So thank you very much, Duncan. Again, first, Evan, I want to congratulate you. I hear that through the grapevine that you just finished a $100 million fundraising close. So congratulations. It's also exciting for us to basically see that resources are being channeled into our space. We talk about trust, right? And another key ingredient for trust is vulnerability, right? The issue is that we live in a world now that we can't afford to have certain vulnerabilities. And then, so that takes us to the world of prevention, right? But that's another bad business, right? Because, as we like to say at Visual Logics, like, people rarely thank you for preventing something that actually never happened, right? So your success is predicated on the fact that nothing happens. And so that's the beauty and the hard thing about what we're seeing here today. We aware of this situation, we embarked on a project that is now a reality, which is basically to create the world's first product passport. And how do you do that? Is that the idea is that, as Julie explained, is that products trade and based on invoices, as we learned from you, they use Excel, and I suspect that number 2 or number 3 software may be Outlook and WhatsApp, right? So the reality is that we can't have our world and our national security and jobs and all these other very important variables hinging on these rudimentary tools, right? I'm not calling Excel rudimentary, though. I still use it quite a bit. But you can't build a product passport based on paper. Right, so paper is one-dimensional. It's no different than a map. It may pinpoint a location, but it tells you nothing about the terrain, right? So we embarked in building this technology that is designed to root out misinformation. And the way we go about this is by dispatching trust in decentralized verifications throughout the world, using the humans actually that basically interact with products on a regular basis. And we realize that every activity, every interaction, every product movement emits signals. And our challenge was, okay, how do we capture the signals and layer them on top of the product? So we've successfully built, and I assume on our audience today is our team, so I want to thank them because it's really them. I'm not a technologist. They built a product that basically fuses the metadata or the breadcrumbs or the fingerprints to the product identity forever. Now, how we do that, it's complex, and I want to give time for you to also present. But at the end, we have an end product that is basically one is what we call the Visual Logics report. And it's basically a tamper-resistant, anomaly-flagged interactive report that also gives you an audit trail and an event tree, right? And on top of that, we then have a second report, which is we call Keep It, because we believe the concept and the notion of KYP, know your product, no different than KYC, know your customer in the financial industry, needs to have a place in our conversations on this topic. I do believe that while people are dangerous and KYC is very important, products can even be more dangerous. So with that, and basically it has some capabilities that self-verify the data that people are putting. So we fetch data and we layer it against the settings, and then if anything outside what we call the envelope then gets flagged and the anomaly. So we are trying to move, well, we believe this world has to move. There's no choice for this. From the trust and verify to the world of verify, then trust. Mm-hmm. And with that, pass it on to you.
Thank you, Jorge. Excellent. And I hope that people in the audience here and online are beginning to see how all of this begins to come together, which is one of the realizations that I had over the past few months, was that I thought when we started this, we were talking about a very niche kind of area. It turns out that this is something which has enormous implications in both policy and, of course, in business. Justin, I'd like to give you the chance now to talk about the ideas that you've shared with us through your paper on building trust in supply chains and why trust matters.
Yeah, so thank you for that. Thank you for having me. I think that trust matters. I come from the supply chain industry, and I've seen the good, bad, and dysfunctional, and I think that we're seeing a development in the world now where we're going to see a lot of decisions that's going to be, yes, it's going to be driven by regulation, but it's also going to be driven by the consumer. The consumers want more transparency, right? And, at Penn State, a lot of those undergrads are teaching me a lot because they're telling me about their how they reach their buying decisions and things like that. They're looking at the organization's mission and vision statements, right? And then whenever we talked about Patagonia yesterday in class, and their decision, they knew more than I did, right? Mm-hmm. I almost shed a tear. But I think that we talk about the voice of the customer from a theoretical perspective, but I think that in order for organizations to keep their competitive advantage, we have to walk the talk in terms of the voice of the customer. Whenever we're talking about trust and transparency with your projects, Washington D.C. the White House just released a framework for digital assets, and I've been shouting from the rooftops for a number of years to bring in the inclusion of blockchain within supply chain, right? So I've been advising about 3 supply chain organizations. They have some great products. IoTex is one of those organizations where they have IoT devices where you can track and trace your goods and then they'll write that information to the blockchain. So we have, you've probably heard of the term NFTs, non-fungible tokens. I think that, with the monkeys that people are talking about, that's just a use case to onboard people. But I think that once these regulators start to look into these digital assets, they're going to say, wait a minute, we might be able to track and trace using NFTs, right? And as we go into Web3 and the inclusion of Web 3.0 with different manufacturing organizations, now we can have generative NFTs. So you can link it to the ERP system, right? And as you walk through the bill of routing, that particular NFT can actually be in a metaverse, for example, right? And then it can start to change, and that consumer or customer can actually see that at any given time because it's connected and it's real time. So at the end of the day, I think that what we talked about in the short time that I was here, it's all about systems thinking. Everything is interconnected. You know, the regulation, the people, all of these organizations are interconnected. And in order to get to where we're trying to go, we have to work together. We work with a number of blockchain protocols to educate college students on blockchain and Web3. And all of these protocols, they're saying we go to these universities, and most universities want to keep everything to themselves. It's like we want all you universities, all you blockchain clubs to work together, because that's the only way we're going to get there to where we're trying to go, right? So I think the same holds true from a supply chain transparency perspective, from a supply chain trust perspective, where we have to work together. And I think that Dr. Alex Edmonds, so one of my favorite TED Talks, Dr. Alex Edmonds, shows that, you know, those organizations that kind of have that sharing, that knowledge sharing approach, that has that sustainability approach, that social impact approach, they beat their competitors year over year. So I think that, you know, if we get to that systems thinking aspect, if we get to this transparency aspect, if we get to this collectivism aspect from a business and supply chain perspective, I think that we'll get to this utopia that we're searching for. Thanks.
Justin, thank you so much for that. We have about 20 minutes left in this event, and we're already beginning to get questions in from our online audience. But I want to offer our in-person audience the opportunity to ask a question. Got a hand raised at the back there. We're going to take. I've got 2 questions ready to go here. So let's take your question in person, and we'll do a round of answers. We've got a couple more. Well, we're going to get lots of questions. This is good. We'll have 2 rounds. Okay, fantastic. Please, sir, go ahead.
Sound like an auctioneer.
I know.
Thanks so much. I'm Jeff Cusick. I'm a fellow downstairs at the Canada Institute this year. Julie, my question is directed toward you. I've been thinking about what implementation of socially inclusive trade policy really means, and one of the leading proposals is looser trade laws. In other words, allowing countries greater flexibility to protect workers during hard times. I wonder what you think, given your mention of anti-dumping, what that means for supply chains, because my hunch is that greater flexibility is just going to mean more frequent disruptions, and I wonder if you have any insight into that.
Yeah.
Julie, if you don't mind, can we take that? I'll give the other 2 questions, then we're actually going to get everybody on the panel to give their answers to these questions. Is that good? Because I think we'll be able to move a little bit more efficiently there. So, first question I've got here is anyone on the panel aware of the defense logistics sector utilizing these emerging technologies? Second, how much can these technologies be scaled down to optimize more micro-level supply chains? A second question from our friend Vishal Kapoor, who is a member of our Global Advisory Council. Thank you for bringing attention to this important topic. Could someone speak to the role of security and compliance that blockchains can play in supply chain transparency and trust? So, Julie, why don't you lead us off on the answer to that specific question? Anybody else who wants to come in on those other 2 questions?
Well, I mean, my reaction to that is that it's going to be enormously difficult to achieve that, right? Because the United States is obviously, and Canada to some extent. I mean, I represent one of the largest exporters from Canada, Canfor of lumber, which is obviously a very big product. But I mean, and they've been subject to U.S. trade laws. But I mean, to give countries flexibility in terms of how they deal with their own industries and labor and all of that, in certain circumstances, that's going to be a tough one, right? Because there are all these laws and regimes in place that really prevent companies or countries from doing that. In fact, there's even a debate between Canada and the U.S. over how to structure an industry, right? I mean, do you have to have private land, or are you allowed to own the land and lease the land? So, I mean, making big changes like that, I think, is going to be very, very difficult.
Would anybody like to speak to the security industry, the defense industry?
I'll give it a whirl.
Please go ahead.
So I won't say anything specifically. I'll maybe speak more generally about public-private partnership and then the opportunity in defense procurement. And these are conversations we're engaged in very actively, so I have to be careful what I say. But if you're purchasing military equipment, or if you're more generally supporting the war effort with logistics,
Shipping stuff to Ukraine.
sure. It would be great if you had a shared map of the world with your defense industrial base and a way to not just see their own supply chain networks, but then to have a conversation about the network itself. And so everybody just read about the F-35 being shut down with the Chinese alloys. So that's fundamentally a problem of unwillingness to share data between the defense contractor on the one hand and then the purchaser on the other hand. So what I'm excited about here with Federation is we can create a shared map of the world without data sharing outright. So we're in a couple of public-private partnership contexts enabling either a border agency or a large buyer to, before approving an import or before making a big purchase, to see the network associated with that shipment or the product family itself or the tier one and extended supply chain of the contractor, and vice versa. So they can have the conversation, they can exchange documentation around specific areas of concern, and they can effectively whitelist the supply chain or the product. So I think there's a real opportunity, again, in Federation for public-private partnership in defense logistics, which we're just scratching the surface of.
Thank you. And of course, you put it very well. It's about that exchange of information in a trusted environment, and trying to build up, ensure that confidentiality is ensured there. On the blockchain question, and Justin, you just mentioned it. Bob, I know that you have some points of view on this. So, Justin, why don't you lead us off on blockchain? The question for Michelle: security compliance that blockchain can play in supply chain transparency and trust, and then we'll turn to Bob.
So I think that in terms of security compliance, there is some research being done in terms of security compliance. I think that it's going to depend upon the use case for blockchain. If it's for the government, we're in a different conversation than if it's for traditional business. But if you are trying to, I know there was a second question about the micro level supply chains and how they can participate. So a lot of these blockchain protocols, such as Polkadot, we had a call with Algorand yesterday. Ethereum does have funds. So with the foundations, they're looking for use cases like this. And they have money to fund these types of use cases. So if you want some more blockchain, more protocols, just reach out to me because even the protocols understand that the supply chain industry is one of those primary areas that are untapped, right? I mean, we can create only so many DeFi protocols, right? So supply chain is one area where these organizations or these foundations are looking to fund. So for those smaller level supply chains that have solutions, those blockchain protocols do have funds within the foundation where they can fund that solution. I mean, like I said, in terms of security, from my perspective, there's some research being done in terms of security right now, because a lot of people said there's some security concerns with blockchains, but a blockchain hasn't got hacked. The people who build on top of the blockchains are the ones who expose the vulnerabilities in the smart contracts, and that's how they get hacked, right? Because the larger the blockchain becomes, the more secure it becomes. So that's another thing of whenever you're looking at blockchains to build on, you have to understand how many nodes those particular blockchains have. Ethereum just went to proof of stake just last week. So they reduced the energy by 99.6% or something like that. Don't quote me on that. You can look it up. But I know there's a big concern in terms of the environmental concerns, but Bitcoin is really the only big one that's still proof of work at this point, given that if they went to proof of stake.
Can I poke on blockchain a little bit?
Please.
So I'm pro Web3. So there's no like philosophical issue that I have, but it's a database. It's a distributed database, and we read and write to a blockchain today. So we plug into different databases, and that's fine. The problem I've always had in supply chain is blockchain is sort of famous for the cold start problem. Right? So how do you generate a network effect that perpetuates itself and then gets everybody onto the ledger or onto the protocol?
Yep.
So it's easy to kind of like zoom out from a policy standpoint and say, well, this whole network could be better were it on blockchain, therefore blockchain's the future. But at the user level, they need the blockchain to make their lives better. And the blockchain is today, but blockchain applications today in supply chain are basically worse in every single way for the user. And so to be constructive about it, one of the use cases I'm paying a lot of attention to on blockchain is actually certificates of origin, because that is a source of intense pain for importers and exporters. They're having to rekey and resubmit product information about their bill of materials. Where did this thing come from? What's my yarn content? What's my cotton content of these jeans, et cetera? And they have to do that over and over and over again, and it's just brain damage. So that to me is one of the sort of edges of the wedge in supply chain applications for blockchain, where you're genuinely solving user pain and can generate a network effect and a real protocol-based network.
Yeah, I think it goes back to we all have to do this together, right? And from a Web3 perspective, that's the biggest pain point, the on-ramp. What's the easiest on-ramp? You know, the big thing within Web3, I know we're getting off topic, but the big thing with Web3 is, you know, we need to make more user intuitive wallets, right? So like take that current pain point at the larger level, and then how do we transfer that over to supply chain and say, you know, how do we easily onboard people, onboard our business partners, onboard our supply chain networks into this, you know, whatever protocol it is. Right. So, you know, we're very early on in this process, but I think that's the Web3, the integration of blockchain, artificial intelligence, and Internet of Things, in a couple of years, quantum computing. You know, I think that's where it's going.
I'm glad you mentioned quantum computing.
You would.
Guilty as charged, nerd at the table. So you hit on a key concern that I've always had with blockchain, which is people tend to try to put a lot of data and use it as a database. The value of blockchain is its immutability and the fact that it's distributed, so there's no one source of trust. I think those are very nice attributes, but what I've always thought about is because of the computational overhead and performance, you actually want to be able to generate regulatory artifacts that are on the blockchain, but not the actual data. So for instance, I've been involved, as I said, with this FDA project, and one of the things that we're investigating is tracking a hash or like a fingerprint of the data, a fingerprint of the algorithm, and a fingerprint of the proof that the algorithm worked on the data, so that you can, for instance, prove that an algorithm actually works for patients all over the country, rather than just on the data set that was used to originally develop it. Those hashes can go to the blockchain, but you certainly wouldn't want to put anything much more than that on. Otherwise, you're just going to have massive bloat. So I think there's absolutely, I mean, some of the attributes of blockchain about, you know, immutability and being distributed are, I mean, there's nothing else like it. And it can be very fast, but you want to use it for the places where it really adds value, as you said. Otherwise, you just introduce pain for not a lot of benefit. On the quantum side, and you also brought up Ethereum proof of stake, which, I mean, I can practically just point back over. So I think there are some questions about whether proof of stake is really as secure as the other way, but I hope it works since it is so much less painful to the environment. And then I was just attending a seminar a couple days ago in which they talked about the fact that quantum computing is going to change some of the security models for blockchain. So the core thing, and I don't need to go on, but the core thing is that quantum computers can break most encryption. And so, in fact, theoretically, many governments are working hard to get quantum computers working so that they can break everybody else's encryption. And so, of course, the blockchain is going to need to adapt to some quantum robust security models probably now. And I think the NSA has actually put out some guidelines just recently. But there's going to be some sort of foundational change in the way we organize information in the blockchain. So there's at least another generation of tech coming before we can really use it forevermore.
We're probably going to lose our web audience on the hour, but for those who are here in person, please feel free to stay on because we'll keep this conversation going. Jorge.
You said whether it be blockchain or any other type of database, the real challenge and the opportunity is to figure out a way to have the digital representation mimic the physical world. And that's the issue, is that things are happening every day. 11 million containers are coming to the U.S. every year via ocean, and another 11 million via truck, and another 2.7 million, I think, via rail. And these are things that are happening 24/7, 365 days. How do you create a digital representation? And it can't be paper. It cannot be a paper because paper always catches up to the activity, but it's never a par with the activity, right? So, and I think with technology, we need to find a way to drill down all the way down to the basic input in textiles or any other industry that we're touching, so we can identify the problem as soon as possible. We like to say in our company that whoever gets to the truth first wins, and that's I think something that we need to live by, especially for national security issues.
Yeah, thanks for mentioning rail. Let's face it, we're looking at the potential for a rail strike here in the United States, which could severely disrupt. I've got a question from Jasper Jung here, and then I would like another couple of questions in the room. One here, absolutely. Jasper.
Thanks, Duncan. Jasper Jung, General Motors. Really appreciate all the insights. I think as an end user, a lot for us to learn and utilize in this space. I have a lot of questions, but I'll just limit myself to two. I want to circle back to Evan's opening comments around the data and aggregating that data to build the trust. I think the fidelity of that data is really, really important. And just wanted to ask, what are some of the challenges that you guys see in aggregating that data? I think when you look at all these global markets and the global integration of supply chains, you see data privacy concerns, all the regulations, market to market. You layer on top of that the national interest in a lot of places like Korea and China. How do you navigate that? What are the challenges that you see in terms of, in terms of, strengthening the fidelity of that data? And then separately, kind of a related question, policy actions. What are solutions, in terms of platforms like the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, for example, where digital and supply chains are really important, but you really don't hear a lot of discussion about this or market-specific policy actions to consider.
Thank you, Jasper. And let me just read, as you're bringing the microphone up front, I'll read another question that came in online. Raw materials, parts, components, and finished goods come in from all over the world. How do we enforce compliance through that network to ensure that foreign upstream agents participate in supplying authentic information? Who bears the cost and what is the cost? And this was something that came up in our pre-event conversation as well about passing the cost on to the private sector. So let's include that in our answers if we can. And please, sir, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself.
Yeah. Good morning. It was very interesting conversation so far. My name is Raoni Rajal. I am a fellow here at the Wilson Center, the Latin American Institute, and a professor back in Brazil, the Federal University of Minas Gerais. And my question actually goes to Julie and also Evan, because my team back in Brazil, I lead a team of around 40 people. We work very closely in issues around supply chain, deforestation-free supply chains, how we can help, especially the government and large companies, to deliver on that. And we assist the Federal Prosecutor's Office in many investigations. We have a formal agreement then. And then what companies they complain to us that quite often they are being investigated for data they don't have access to, especially invoice data and sanitary information data that, due to our access, we have access to. That's how we help them. So what should be the role of governmental data infrastructures in actually building trust on supply chains? Thank you.
Thank you so much. And two other questions that came in, I'll just mention the themes. One was on, factoring in those ESG components with a specific focus on environment, and secondly, cross-border data flows. How do we overcome that obstacle? So, Justin, why don't we go down the line here, beginning with you, Justin, and ending with Evan.
So I think that how we handle the ESG, I think we still need, from a regulatory perspective, I still think we have some work to be done in terms of ESG. The SEC just released a report back in March where organizations have to report in terms of what they're doing from a climate perspective. So I think that's the first step. But I think that one thing that a lot of people get away from is, ESG and sustainability is more than just environmental, right? We need to look at the societal aspects of things, right? We need to look at the profit, philanthropic, however you want to say it. But we have to look at it from a quadruple bottom line perspective, where we need to look at the organization's purpose, right? And I think that needs to be trackable, traceable, and to be able to be validated, right? You see where I'm going with this, but it needs to be transparent to everyone. And I think that if we increase the transparency, I think you're actually going to get some additional feedback loops, and I think that that's going to inform policymakers on where we should move in terms of ESG and things like that, because a lot of it, some of y'all may disagree with me. Some of it's theoretical at this point, right? But I think that, if we start to make the data transparent outside of those four walls of those organizations, I think that, the feedback from the consumers, I think would guide us to better solutions.
Thank you. Jorge, would you like to participate in this?
No, I'll take a pass.
Okay. Julie, on the question of compliance.
Well, answering your question, in the United States, we certainly, and I believe in Europe also, have taken the position that it's really the private party's responsibility, right, to inquire and to have these sort of systems in place. And it's historically been correct that the private sector has probably been quicker to respond to these things than the government has. And I think there also is a growing sentiment, at least in this country, that favors enforcement, right, rather than cooperation. And that is a big problem because, if that is the case, it's sort of the evolution of the U.S. Customs Service and Border Protection. We were talking about this before the conference started. It really used to be more sort of that Customs was out there to try to make sure that everybody understood where things came from and how to do it, and worked with companies to do that. I think now the focus is much more on catching people doing the wrong thing, and then in many cases, like in EPA investigations, not even disclosing that to the parties until much later in the process. So I think there has to be a change in that, right? Because if you really want to do it, you can't assume that everybody's doing it deliberately and fraudulently and all of that. You've got to build some kind of cooperation with the government so that they can help you to advance those things.
I think there's a way to incentivize it, and all we have to do is cut and paste the model that Clear created, right? Which is basically, it's not a mandatory, but it's definitely a convenience to have something like global entry or Clear. So if you're able to fast track through the process by contributing to part of the platform, I think it's a win-win, because then you have lower demurrage, lower detention of trucks, faster importation process, whatever. So I think there's a happy medium that could accomplish this. And I think that the Clear model, which is a private, public sector basically arrangement, could very well work in this type of global trade. I couldn't envision any company that couldn't benefit from this, and have a tremendous incentive, right? I still wonder when I see people in line at global, they don't have global entry. I say, why wouldn't they? And also, I think it's very telling when you have a company that decides not to participate in something like this. Actually, I think it's very telling. So sometimes what this shows is interesting, but what it hides is even more interesting. And I think we need to find a way to do that. And the moment that somebody, and I see some people here that may get there and get this done, I think that we're going to see incredible progress fast forwarded because companies really need this. Nobody wants to be stuck in the Port of California for weeks and weeks waiting for ships to be unloaded and then for customs to clear, right? So I think there's a way to create an ecosystem that is a win-win for all the parties.
Thank you, Jorge. Bob.
Sure. So just thinking about ESG, and at OII we take in data on carbon and some other factors to help decision makers in the enterprise weigh the different factors. So I can't really speak to compliance, but I think in terms of driving changes in the way people do things, making that information transparent so that enterprise decision makers know what trade-offs they're making. If you're trading off two different modes of transportation, or more importantly, two vendors, and they have very different environmental impacts, having that be part of your decision-making process and have it be transparent to your process can have a huge impact in motivating them. Now, I wouldn't, on that basis, wouldn't be able to prove they weren't lying. On the other hand, Evan can, so.
Thanks, Bob. Evan, why don't you bring us home?
I'll take two themes here. So one was around the data, and then the second was around network incentives and architectures that solve some of the problems you raised, and can also actually motivate more information availability. So let's start with the data problem. So we're talking about a world of mostly text data, some image data. It's extremely fragmented. It's protected around concerns of data sovereignty, of intellectual property, of data privacy and security. So we can't imagine naively that this is all just going to come together in one place. And that's the point of our company. We built this federated platform for meeting the data where it is, but taking the thumbprint of that data and benefiting the network from that thumbprint. So how do you do that? So we are using natural language processing and machine learning to deal with very, very messy data across different languages, different scripts. If anybody's ever seen a bill of lading or a commercial invoice, you can appreciate the complexity of the problem. And if there was a unique identifier for every company in the world and every product in the world, this would be a solved problem. There is no such identifier. We're actually building unique Altana IDs for each of these places and products and companies. So you're never perfectly capturing ground truth, is the honest answer. We talk about it as asymptoting toward truth through multiple observations. So we can see imports and exports coming out of China. We can see through booking request and shipping instructions data certain intermodal transfers of goods. We can look in the corporate registries and see shell companies being formed and vacated as certain companies respond to new compliance and regulation. So you're sort of constantly remodeling the world, and you're doing it probabilistically. And as you get more and more observations, you get a better and better approximation of that reality. And this starts to tie into network incentives. So we're actually designing in the platform a number of collaboration features so that a big enterprise like GM can engage its tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, tier 4 through a shared source of truth and deal with a compliance issue or a demand planning issue, or say, I need this piece of information in order to do my ESG reporting. And that's a way for somebody with a lot of leverage on the network, like a GM, to extract information from the network and validate it and cross-reference it. That same architecture can be applied in a public-private partnership context. So we talked about Clear for Cargo. We're actually doing a pilot of that right now with one of the big global express carriers. So we are providing a trust score, a machine learning derived trust score, before the packages are even loaded on the airplane. And we're facilitating the pre-clearance of roughly half of those shipments before they even take off. So they can actually reposition the high trustworthy green-lit packages on the plane, put all the kind of ambiguous stuff on the back of the plane, and the pre-cleared stuff sails through customs. I'll just put it this way, it can take longer to fly the plane to that country than it does to clear customs. So the network speed incentives are pretty profound at scale. And what that does then, as you sort of extrapolate that out, is it motivates the network to provide more information about itself for these procurement benefits, for these trade facilitation benefits, for maybe an insurance benefit down the line. So we think really deeply about how to create those public-private financial services and sort of market access network incentives that motivate more information availability. And one of the kind of concepts Alan Burson baked into my head was our opportunity now, rather than picking needles out of the haystack from an enforcement standpoint, our opportunity with this technology is to qualify the haystack.
Thank you to all of our panelists. Thank you to our audience who's here in person and online. We've barely scratched the surface of this, even though it's been a very complex and nuanced conversation. I'll leave you with one thing: a headline in the Wall Street Journal today, saying that the European Union is moving towards requiring companies to share data on their supply chains in times of crisis. So adding another layer of complexity onto what we already know, that in the future, companies are going to be held responsible for where their goods come from, but also they will be working alongside governments in what may be ultimately the weaponization of supply chains, or the ways in which supply chains can be used to exert international influence. And with that very big question mark, I will close. Thank you so much for watching.